In this video, we want to talk specifically about how populations evolve. So I think a very important thing that we want to begin with is this idea that individuals do not evolve. It's populations that evolve. So, for example, when we think about what happens to individuals, so here we have an individual. What's happening to individuals? Well, we know natural selection is what acts on individuals. What does this mean, natural selection? Well, it's this idea of differential survival. Some individuals will have traits that are different than others that help them survive. In other words, survival of the fittest. So natural selection can act on individuals, but individuals themselves are not doing the evolution. It's the population as a whole that's actually evolving. And this is a really important distinction. Populations evolve, not individuals. Okay? So populations are evolving. What's happening to the population? Well, because natural selection is acting on individuals and individuals make up populations, that means the genetic makeup of a population will change over time. And those traits which are favorable will become more common in the population. Take, for example, our peppered moth, and we're going to look at some more examples of peppered moths in a moment. But this peppered moth has some camouflage that helps it blend into this particular environment. So over time, the population might evolve to have this trait of camouflage. The individual peppered moth, it helped it to survive, so natural selection was working on it. But we can't say that this individual moth evolved. The population of moths evolve. It's a really important distinction. Okay, so what's leading to this variation? I said that peppered moth, it had some variation that helped it help its population evolve. So what's leading to that variation? How did it become camouflaged? Well, the important thing to remember is that mutations lead to variation. So variations in our phenotype, right, our physical characteristics, those are directed through variations in our DNA. You know that your DNA or your genotype is what determines the phenotype. So your DNA determines your physical characteristics. So how does this work? And I'm going to use the example of eye color. If there is a mutation that occurs in the DNA, right? So here's your DNA. Some mutation occurs for whatever reason, right? These things break apart or we get a substitution. That changes the DNA. A mutation in the DNA changes, as you can see, right, the particular nucleotide. So instead of a G here, maybe this is a T, right? So a mutation in the DNA changes the sequence of the DNA. Well, what does DNA code for? We know that DNA codes for RNA, but that ultimately codes for proteins, right? So it's the protein then, if there's a mutation, that will be different. So here you can see we got something going on with that protein, but notice we got some different amino acids. Since proteins are made up of amino acids, and amino acids are coded from DNA, well then we're going to have a change here in this protein. Okay, so a change in the DNA means a change in the protein. What's that mean about variation? Well, you know proteins are what make up our traits or our phenotypes. So in this case of a simple mutation in eye color, right? We've got a lot of variation in eye color. And so a change in the protein, the pigment in the eye color, would give a phenotypic change. So it's important to remember that mutation leads to variation in our traits. Another thing that increases variation or variety is sexual reproduction. Sex increases variation. Because if you think about it, one ancestor has a lot of descendants. And when those descendants mate or sexually reproduce, there's going to get a lot of recombinations of that DNA. So take, for example, this random family I found on the internet. Here's a family. We got dad and mom and dad here. Notice we've got two progeny, two offspring. Do they look exactly the same? No, of course not. Do you look exactly the same as your brother and sisters? It's possible, but there's probably some variation. Notice here, this kid's got some blonde hair. This kid got a little auburn color, maybe a little red in there from mom. So how is it that these two parents had sex twice and had two different looking children? Well, the answer is that there's different recombinations. There are lots of combinations of our DNA when we reproduce. Because remember, half of the genetic information will come from dad, half will come from mom. So there's many different ways that DNA can recombine to make different traits in our offspring. And the same, of course, applies to insects or plants or whatever you want to think about. Here we have a bunch of ladybugs that have reproduced. And you can see, even from all these eggs, there's some variation within these bugs as well. So sexual reproduction increases variation. And that variation then will impact natural selection, because if you think about it, some of these insects are going to have a variation, some phenotypic, some characteristic difference that will either increase or decrease their fitness. And when we say fitness, that's a general term for, can it survive? Can it mate? Can it escape a predator? Can it get food? So what is its fitness? Today we think of fitness as like, do you go to the gym and lift heavy things? That's not necessarily fitness when we're thinking of natural selection. So if you think of all of these different, you see the variation, like this one's got a lot of spots. This one doesn't have as many. So maybe the ones with more spots, let them blend in better, or the one with a different lighter complexion helps it blend in. Or maybe they've got a biochemical difference, right? A biochemical difference in their body, which allows them to process food differently. So some individuals are going to be more fit. So through the process of variation, through the process of sexual reproduction, some individuals are more fit. Therefore, those are the ones that will survive and pass those genes on to the next generation. Okay, so when we say evolution, what we're really meaning, if you get down to it, we're talking about the change in allele frequency. So maybe now you're saying, Herder, I don't remember what an allele is. Do you remember when we were talking about genotype and we said, okay, this person here is big A, little a, or maybe they've got one dominant gene, one recessive gene. Each different variation of a gene is called an allele. So maybe you got the dominant allele, maybe you got the recessive allele. So really, what evolution is just the change in the frequencies of these genes over time. So if you had a population that had a lot of dominant alleles, and over time it started changing and you saw more of the recessive alleles coming out, that change is just what evolution is. Now, if you take all the genes and all the alleles in the population, that's just your gene pool. So some people, you might hear someone say, well, there's a shallow gene pool there. That's, I think, supposed to be an insult, meaning there's not a lot of variation in those genes, okay? So in this example, you can see there is a lot of variation in this gene pool. This is a specific example of some variation in mussel species. And there's a lot of variation, a lot of different alleles in this species. So this is a pretty healthy community because there's so much variation. Now, you might be saying, well, what then affects? So if I know that evolution is just the change in alleles, what is it that's changing those allele frequencies? So I've got a little smart art graphic here for you. There are three things that really we talk about changing the allele frequency: natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. Now, natural selection we've talked a bit before, but I'm going to review that in the next slide. These two are probably new to you if you're watching these videos in order: genetic drift and gene flow. Okay? And I'm going to distinguish those in the next, throughout this PowerPoint podcast. Genetic drift is further divided into founder effect and bottleneck. And gene flow is really just about migration, immigration with an I and an E, right? Going into and out of a population. So the rest of this podcast, I'm really going to be talking about these things here. what are the factors that alter populations, or what are the factors that alter the genes or the alleles in a population. So we'll start with natural selection, the first one, and you know this. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a different example than what we've been talking about. Let's think about insecticide and drug resistance. Okay, so let's say you got a farm, right? Herder's got a little bit, that's not a farm, it's a garden. Okay, I just have a garden. But imagine you had a farm, and you've got lots of bugs out there on the farm, and you want to go by and spray it with a lot of pesticides so that your crops won't be eaten up by bugs. All right, so you go by, you spray the pesticide, it kills a lot of the pests, a lot of the bugs, but you're left with a few over because pesticides are not going to kill all of them, right? Some bugs might naturally have a resistance to that particular pesticide, okay? Well, what's going to happen? The one that survives, those are going to be the ones that reproduce. Notice here in our later generation that we've got many different, we've got a very different genetic makeup. We've got a lot more of these alleles that have this property for survival, right? Look at all of these red bugs, and don't think color. This one's not about color. This is just showing you that these are the bugs that survived. So look here, in this first generation, there was a lot of bugs that couldn't survive. In this generation, there are more bugs that can, and over time, the more pesticides we use, notice what's happening. The shift occurs in the population. The bugs, the insects, are getting more and more resistant to these pesticides. Okay? This is natural selection in action. So as you can see, the genes, the alleles literally shifted. We see evolution right before us in even just a few generations. A lot of people say, oh, evolution, it occurs millions and millions of years. We can't see it today. Completely wrong. We can see evolution occurring through just a few generations if you look at the insect populations in some of these farms and these farming communities. Okay, so that was the first one. How do genes change? Through natural selection. So we could literally see here over the course of, 150-ish years, evolution occurring. And so this is a famous example. It's the industrial melanism example. And if you think about in Europe, at the age of the industrial age, or at the beginning of the industrial age, things changed. This is very well documented. So they did a study on these peppered moths. Here's the dark variety. Here's the light variety of the peppered moth. And so in 1848, when they did the survey, only 5% of the moths were dark variety, 95% were the light variety. Well, then the Industrial Revolution happened. What happened to the trees? What happened to everything in this area? It got covered with all this soot and with all of this, all these pollutants. And actually, a lot of the color of the wildlife changed. So what you're seeing here is, whereas before, in 1848, most of them were light, that helped them blend into this background. The bugs would eat the dark ones. The birds would eat the ones that they could easily see. But in 1895, when they did a survey, look at this. By then, 98% had evolved, changed the population, the gene frequency had changed to these darker varieties, because those were blending in with the soot, the pollution-covered trees, and the birds didn't see those. They saw the ones that were sticking out then. Well, then, of course, there's been, since the Industrial Revolution, there's been a lot of efforts to clean up, to stop the pollution. So the trees have gone back to their natural color, and we can see that the population has shifted again. So we can literally see evolution occurring just over 150 years in the lifetime of recorded history with these peppered moths. Okay, so that's evolution in action because of natural selection. So the second example we want to talk about is genetic drift. Genetic drift is non-selection, so this is not natural selection. This is a random chance thing that's occurring, and there's two of them that might occur. So genetic drift, there are two types. One, the founder effect. Two, the bottleneck. So when you think of founder effect, think of the word founder. Some people go, splinter off, and found a new colony, right? They're the founders. Bottleneck is when some disaster occurs and it really bottlenecks the population. So it reduces the population pretty small, and then they have to sort of start and recover again. So I'm going to specifically go over the founder effect first. So this is when a new population starts with only a few individuals. So let's say we've got this island or this land mass with all these variations of ladybugs. And then let's say that a few of them fly over, maybe there's a storm, and a few of them fly over to another island. Oh, looky there. They flew over, and these are now on this new island. Well, what's going to happen over here on this new island? Well, these bugs are going to mate, right? So those two bugs that happen to be green are going to mate. They're going to make a bunch of other green bugs. So now if you look at this island, the population of ladybugs is very different than the original population. So we call this the founder effect. It's when maybe a rarer allele goes somewhere else and is in a higher frequency. It's skewed the gene pool in this new population, right? In this old population, they were mostly red. But because a few of them went over here and started a colony over here on this new place, now the population is sort of skewed to the green. Another example I often use is if you had two red-headed people that went to a desert island, started reproducing many generations later, the entire population of that island might have red hair. Now that's not common in our in the mass majority of places around the globe, but if the redheads found the island and their descendants inhabited the island, then that's what you would see. Another great example of this is blood type. So if you think about how humans evolved, we call it the out of Africa hypothesis, right? So humans start to spread out of Africa, cross the plate, maybe cross through here, eventually come down through here, and then go on down to South America. And we can actually trace the evolution of humans by just tracing blood type. Because we'll notice, and this is a distribution of group O blood, that down here in South America, 70 to 100% of the population actually has this O blood type, which you may remember is little I, right? That's the genotype. These are the universal donors. And you can sort of trace it through. Come over here, right? Look in India, look in parts of Asia, very small, much smaller amounts of O blood type in those populations. So this is another example of how the founder's effect, the people that came and found an area, their blood type was the one that essentially populated the area, and we have a different type or distribution of those alleles because of the founders. So the other example of genetic drift is bottleneck. So think about this. A bottleneck event is when a population is drastically reduced. Well, what could cause that? Maybe a famine, natural disaster, loss of habitat, a lot of poaching, right? Here we got a bunch of beads in a bottle. Imagine if you took a bunch of beads in a bottle and you turned it upside down and only a few got through the neck of the bottle. Here's our distribution. And then you did it again. Notice that the distributions are changed throughout several different generations. If there's a bottleneck effect, the initial frequency, they were all kind of equal. But if a bottleneck occurs, you'll see over time the generations have different distributions. It looks like the blue maybe got bottlenecked and we're growing in the red. So maybe when a disaster occurred, only the blue and the red in this case survived through several generations of natural selection. Our 10th generation frequency distribution is very different than the original. Okay, so let's give you some actual examples of this. Take, for example, our northern elephant seals, right? There was a big bottleneck which greatly reduced the population of these northern elephant seals. A lot of poaching, a lot of some natural disasters. And what's happened over time is that they've come back, but as they've recovered, their genetic variation is much lower. So these northern elephant seals are actually much more closely related than they originally were. Because if you think about a population size, and then an event occurs, and the population goes way down, they can either go extinct, or they can recover, And when they recover, it's only a few that had survived, so the variation in the population has really been wiped out. So we get a loss of variation in this gene pool. The most prime example that a lot of people talk about is the cheetah bottleneck that occurred with the hunting and the poaching of these beautiful animals. We now think some estimates are that all cheetahs have a less than 1% diversity. So they're almost all basically clones of each other. So if there's some other really natural or bad natural event come over, or maybe some disease, they could wipe out this cheetah population because they're all so similar. Okay, so that's a bottleneck. That's under the description of genetic drift. The third example we want to look at here is gene flow. And this sounds just, it was named appropriately. If genes flow somewhere else. And this is what we're talking about with migration, whether that's emigration, going out, or immigration, right, coming in. That is when genes or individuals move from one area to the other. So there becomes this genetic mixing with gene flow. So take, for example, all this population of yellow butterflies. If one were to migrate into a population of orange butterflies, if they were close enough in species that they could mate, well, these yellow alleles are going to get mixed in to the orange alleles, so we're going to have some gene flow. So this is another way that evolution can occur, changes can occur over time by this gene flow. And then finally, we want to end with a discussion about today. Where's human evolution going? I get this question a lot. Are humans still evolving? Of course we are. We are continuing to evolve. And none more obvious examples by what's happening with globalization, right? Humans are changing because our alleles are easily being distributed in between populations. I could go down to the Charlotte Douglas Airport, get on an airplane today, Matt. I'd have to be appropriate, right, to get on the airplane. But I have to book my flight and everything. But I could be in India. I could be in Africa tomorrow or later today. We are transferring, because of globalization and because of transportation, we can go around the globe so easily. So what we're seeing over time is that gene flow in human populations is increasing. So we're seeing that we're going to have, or we're predicting, many scientists are predicting, that we'll have less distinct differences in humans over time because our genes are constantly mixing with each other. And our genes, therefore, the genetic flow has increased in the population. Several years ago, Times published an article about the new face of America. And it's about essentially how when in America, when we have so many immigrants that have come to our communities and that are helping our communities and that are now embedded into our communities, that we're seeing what some might have thought of as a typical white American, that is changing in our country, right? Because of our alleles that are mixing with each other. And this image is actually a computer-generated image of the mix of several races. And we know that race in particular is not really a biological, there's no gene for race, right? What makes up what you might consider to be a race is actually several different genes, several different alleles, several different characteristics or phenotypes in a human. All right, so where are humans going? It's interesting that the next generation is probably going to be more blended. It's going to be, because of globalization, we're just going to see lots of more continued evolution, lots of changes in our genetic makeup. It's an interesting time in the world, a great time, I think, to be a world citizen, to see how the literal face of our country and our planet is changing. If you found this video interesting on your journey of academic growth, I would hope that you would like and subscribe to the video so that I can continue to make more videos to share biology with you.